you very much, Mr. Toastmaster. What I like most about level 4 is that this is very much open forum. We get to chat a little bit more than me just sitting here and having to lecture to y'all. What I will say is I did have to hide my cutting knife because we are in a hospital, so I had no idea what the situation was. That said, who here likes to go fishing? It's totally cool if you don't like it, and that's absolutely fine. Fish are slimy. I understand. Now, who here would say that they'd be willing to wake up at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning and come fishing as well, right? Oh, okay, so people are up in the mornings, I get it, but slimy fish, so I understand that.
Well, Drew, I've never been fishing, but I think fishing is stupid, and it's for people who like to sit around and do nothing for hours at a time. That's just what I think.
That's absolutely, Cliff, that's totally understandable. What I will say is, and I'm sorry for not saying this at the beginning, we will have a moment at the end of this to be able to ask me questions, kind of talk a little bit more about what fishing means to you, as well as it kind of what it means to me. So that's fantastic, Cliff. I totally understand that. Hope I get to touch your point. Now, what I will say is, I kind of want to paint a picture a little bit more as to why I enjoy fishing the most. If you can put yourself in at 6:30 in the morning, the sun's just peeking up above the trees. You got mist or fog coming up off the lake or pond or whatever body of water that you're fishing. But more importantly, it's the sounds.
The what?
And the sounds. Sorry, my words. It's the sounds. You have the crickets. You have the birds. The sound of the water, the sound of the trees. And I apologize if I wasn't dictating a lot. Yeah, no, and I think that's the most important thing is when it comes to where you're putting yourself in, and especially touching Liz's point when it comes to stress.
Would you consider yourself an expert at fishing?
Expert, no. Do I get paid for it? No, I do not, Chris. So when it comes to getting paid for it, I don't, but at the same time, I do spend a few hours a week fishing, so more or less, I wanted to take more time and speak to you guys in regards to.
So not an expert, but you're kind of positioning yourself as someone who knows a lot, probably more than the average person.
I would
fish
say
a lot.
I would absolutely know more than the average bear.
Like me? I
think Chris is a better fisher than you?
Well, I have a great timeline when it comes to this speech, so I'd love to be able to get to that. And if you guys want to ask questions afterwards, we'd be happy to touch it. Now, ultimately, when it comes to fishing, I think there's 3 categories of the timeline, as well as when it comes to the type of water that you're fishing, and then the level of the water that you're fishing. So obviously we've been talking about morning a lot. You can fish in the AM, you can fish in the morning. What I would say, you can also fish around the 11 o'clock to 1:30 time frame. And if you want to move a little bit further on down the timeline, you can fish to around 6:30 to 8:45 until the sun peaks down.
Like breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Almost like on lunch and dinner. That's exactly right. Now, what I would say is, when it comes to the type of water column that you're fishing, that's the most important when it comes to the timeline. So top water. Everyone, when you do speak about fishing, top water comes to be a large talking point. Now, top water is, I do have a particular version here that I will like to pull out if I could get all my poles in order. So in parts of reserving myself and hooking myself, I do have something called a spook bait. Now, when it comes to a spook, what this is going to do is it's basically going to be on the top of the water always. It will not dip below the water in any way, shape, or form. It will also zigzag in the water column if you fish it correctly. What this does, and largemouth bass, I can say it a couple of times tonight, but largemouth bass are stupid. They're stupid. Now, what I will say is, when it comes to something that entices themselves, largemouth bass are also predatory creatures. So first and foremost, a largemouth, and when it comes to being in a pond, a largemouth is going to be one of the top of their food chains in that particular pond, lake, creek, or river. Now, a topwater bait is going to do one of two things. Either A, is going to take whatever largemouth bass is in the general area and move it toward that bait, or B, it will then trigger a react response. So because we're in fall time, summertime, fall time, topwater baits are a go-to. The reason why, and because it triggers that reaction response from that predatory creature or largemouth bass, they're spawning. And spawning, without bringing fishing terms, they're laying eggs and creating more bass. So with what's interesting about bass and fish in general is that they're schooling creatures. So they're gonna want to protect their young.
That's why my grandfather fished with dynamite.
You know
Get 'em
what?
all at once.
That's an effective way of fishing, and we can actually talk about that in the question form. So we can definitely discuss that as well. Now, what I would say, and I think topwater is the most efficient when it comes to, you have little bass in your pond. You understand that there are obviously large bass there that are going to be protecting those little bass. And what a topwater bait will do is kind of trigger that reaction response from a protectionary standpoint as well as a predatory standpoint as well. So when you get to the middle of the day, I think especially summer into fall, that sun obviously is continuing to move across the sky. Now with that, the heat of the sun continues to heat up whatever body of water that you're fishing as well. And with that, fish are obviously, well, I want to say obviously, but fish are cold-blooded creatures. So what will have to happen is they have to warm themselves up based off of the sun and their standpoints in regard to bathing in the sun. So
I didn't understand, what is cold-blooded creatures you say?
Sure, yeah. So cold-blooded versus warm-blooded. Us humans, we're warm-blooded creatures. So our blood is regulated at around 97.8 degrees Fahrenheit. When you get a cold-blooded creature like a fish or a reptile, they have to warm their bodies up to then warm their blood as well. So reptiles are cold-blooded as well as fish. So that's kind of how they regulate their body temperature. So when it comes to middle column fishing, kind of when I'm in the middle of the day, the sun is the peak temperature, I'm not necessarily gonna wanna fish the top of the water. I'm gonna wanna fish a little bit lower in the middle where they're suspended, not necessarily at the bottom of the pond, but not necessarily at the top because it's gonna be way too hot up there. So when I'm fishing a middle
Have
column.
you actually ever fished in your life before?
I have,
can't believe that you haven't even talked about monofilament versus braided line,
Hey.
let alone the fact that we haven't even introduced the poundage of the line.
Absolutely.
What are you doing up there?
Well, that's the thing. When it comes to topwater line, line doesn't necessarily matter, Bill. And I think that's a great point. So when I'm fishing the middle column, I'm gonna want to fish a monofilament line. And when Bill gets angry at me when it comes to monofilament and braided is something a little bit more than a tassel. It's almost like a rope. And a monofilament is like a clear sort of plasticky line that you can use as well. So monofilament is more useful when it comes to a middle column or suspended bait, because fish, as I said at the beginning, largemouth are dumb. They're dumb, but they can also see. So if something is moving around and you have a big bait moving, but there's also a big old rope, this green line attached to it, fish they will notice. So what a monofilament line will do is ultimately kind of creates the illusion of there is no line there, and it will allow that fish to kind of take a little bit more time to look at the bait, analyze it, and see if it's something that it wants to eat. So that's really what a middle column is for. I can fish a tiny worm here. I can fish something that looks a little bit more like a little creature. But to be honest with you, those little, I call it a wacky worm. But that little wacky worm is the best way to fish a middle column currently. Now, the last thing, and I think probably the most important when it comes to whether it be an evening bite or you're out fishing, and we could talk about this in a bit, but you're out fishing with me and you can't catch a darn thing and you don't know what's going on. This, in my opinion, is your go-to bait. I call this the flippin' rig. Now, all this flippin' rig is a tiny little creature bait with a bobber stopper on the end of my line, as well as a 3-ounce hook, as well as a 3-ounce weight on the back of this. What this allows me to do is ultimately put this bait through a large mat or lily pads or moss or whatever those bass that have been through that heat of the entirety of the day with the sun baking on the pond. At the end of the day, they love to be nestled up under that moss. All the shade is up there, they're cooling off from the day, and that's where ultimately frogs come in. You know, you get a little bit more bait fish coming into the end or closer up to the bank of the pond, and that's when you can catch fish. I think the biggest thing, and I say, you know, kind of when I said in the beginning about the complexities of fishing, it's more about the timeline, when you're fishing and knowing what those fish are ultimately doing at that time to really maximize your fishing efforts at the time as well. So I hope I answered a majority of the questions that were asked of me, but more importantly, are there any questions for me today?
What kind of bodies of water do you fish in?
Yeah, ponds in particular. So I love to walk on a pond, bank fish. If I can, I will fish a creek a little bit, but that's getting into smallmouth territory, and smallmouth are a little bit smarter than largemouth bass. So when you're fishing ponds and everything else, that's definitely what you want to, yeah, that's what I fish. So.
Question time is over.
Okay, perfect. We have a timeline, folks. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.